Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in medieval philosophy. In this lesson, what we're going to do is move on to topic number 3 of our series, and we're going to focus for the next 2 lessons on the writings, the life, and the works of Boethius. Now, Boethius' full name is written there. I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I don't speak Latin, but we'll take an introduction to Boethius in this lesson. And then what we will do in the next lesson is talk about arguably his most important philosophical contribution. And I say most important philosophical contribution in the context of an individual who not only wrote his own ideas about philosophy, which is what we'll talk about in the next lesson when we look at on the consolidation of philosophy, but also, and quite importantly, did a lot of work in translating old philosophical texts, the sort of works and the writings of the classical period. So we'll do both of those things across these 2 lessons. But for now, we'll take an introduction to the next of our major topics, of course, talking about the life, the works, and the writings of Boethius. Now, there is a reason why Boethius is such an interesting character within the broader context and the broader study of medieval philosophy. He was an incredibly renowned character at the time, when we see major shifts in the doctrines of Christianity, especially when we look at the role of the distinction between Constantinople on the one hand and the rest of the Western world, the world, of course, of the Catholic Church, or the development, or the growth of the Catholic Church, the Roman See. Now, fundamentally, we cannot really divorce this kind of theological conception and this kind of history of Christianity from the writings of Boethius and from the life of Boethius, because Boethius, of course, was particularly renowned and quite an astute political character. So you have to bear in mind, of course, the fact that at this point, very, very clearly, and even prior to Boethius, we obviously see the division of the empire. The Roman Empire collapses in the Western world, and they move all the way to the east, where we see the establishment of what is sometimes traditionally known as the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire. And this obviously starts to grow in terms of the divisions between the Eastern Roman Empire, the Constantinople See, and the Western world, the Roman See, in terms of the ways in which doctrines of Christianity become to be interpreted. This all obviously culminates a few hundred years later in the Great Schism, the division between the Catholic Church and then the Eastern Orthodox Church. On the other hand. But beginning first then, the exact date of Boethius' birth is not necessarily known to us. We know that it is generally around the year 480 AD, so you can sort of date his birth from around that time. We know, though, that his childhood, his birthplace, and his family proved to be a very important development in the understanding of Boethius and our ways in which we understand Boethius as specifically a philosopher. He was born into a very, very wealthy and notable family in the Roman Empire. His father would die when Boethius was very young, around 487. Again, of course, not knowing the date of his birth, we don't really necessarily know exactly when how old Boethius was when his dad dies, but we know that he was quite young, okay? At least in terms of dating it here, if we were to say that his birth was 480 AD and that his dad's death was 487, we know obviously that he died when he was 7. He would then be adopted into a very wealthy and notable senatorial family within the later period of the Roman Empire, the Samaci family, which would, again, go from a serious position in wealth and nobility when he was born to then being adopted into also a very wealthy and notable family within the later period of the Roman Empire, a senatorial family made up of senators from the Roman Senate. As a result of this opportunity, he is obviously able to get a good access to education, and he would notably be someone who excelled in the development and the acquisition of language. And languages was something that was very, very important to Boethius. Given the fact that he was able to master Greek and Latin through his education, it meant that he was able to draw attention to the works of the classical Greek philosophers, the people like the Platos and the Aristotles. Mainly Plato. If you remember at points made in previous lessons, the sort of rediscovery of Aristotelian writings takes place a little bit later, but we at least have a good understanding of Platonic writings, as well as obviously the later period of Roman philosophers. At the time, some of the original writings of Plato and Aristotle only existed in their original Greek translations, and so it was up to Boethius to essentially translate these ideas from the Greek into the Latin, and then again spreading across into different languages therein. And that is one of the things that he becomes very important for in terms of his contributions to philosophy. And this is what I mentioned earlier on, that when we talk about Boethius, we don't just necessarily talk about Boethius from the perspective of his actual unique and novel contributions to philosophy when we look at his writings, but also to his contributions to the translations of philosophical ideas from the ancient Greek and from the ancient Greek writings into Latin. So it would turn out that Boethius was not somebody who was going to dedicate himself entirely to scholarship and to academia, whatever that actually refers to in this period in history. He instead wanted to pursue a clear career in politics. And so this is really where we go from Boethius being quite a seminal and important contributor to philosophy, at least in terms of translating texts, but then also into a very, very important contributor to basic political systems that take place during this period. He would rise to the power through the service of Theodoric the Great, who was the king of the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy between 493 and 526. For those of you who aren't particularly interested in sort of the later Roman Empire and the early medieval period, you don't necessarily need to know all of the intricacies of the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy or Theodoric the Great or any of these different things. Just know that he would essentially, Boethius that is, would essentially rise through the ranks into becoming particularly important within the ranks of government. By the year 510, he made a name for himself within these ranks, becoming a very young Roman senator and then consul. He would eventually take up the role of the Magister Officiorium, who basically was one of the most senior roles within the Roman Senate. So this is obviously a very, very important individual, a very, very important political and diplomatic individual, not only somebody who was important for his contributions to philosophy. Now, one of the things that is also quite interesting to note, and one of the things that we see in the image of Boethius above the screen, is that he does eventually get executed. His downfall is really where we see the writings of some of his original texts on philosophy, on his consolidations of philosophy, is written while he was in prison, as we will note in the next lesson. There is some scholarly debate among classicists and medieval historians as to the true nature of Boethius' downfall. Many do, however, agree that his downfall began probably as the result of the loss of his loss in royal favour, owing to some of the building up of tensions between the Eastern and Western churches. We know that eventually in 1054, communication is lost between the Holy See and the Constantinople See. Note here that the first See is spelt wrong, not See in the sense of the body of water, See as in the sort of seat of the Christian doctrine, the Holy See being, of course, in Rome. In the Vatican, even to this day, Constantinople See obviously existing in the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. 1054 represented, of course, the Great Schism within the Church, but the fall in power can be seen when we look at Boethius' contributions to the relationship between the East and West churches of Christianity some 500 years prior to the Great Schism. But in terms of the practical events that take place on the ground, his fall from power is generally agreed upon as taking place when an administrative officer by the name of Sophronius, Sophronius is accused both Boethius and another individual of treasonous acts. The general charge was that Boethius had been planning a revolution, and 3 witnesses were produced to corroborate this charge. Now, the exact extent to which Boethius actually was guilty of these charges is beyond the scope of this lesson and beyond the scope of this series on medieval philosophy. But it is an interesting little crumb of history to look at this. And there are debates, again, among scholars, among historians, and among classicists, and even theologians and philosophers, about the extent to which these 3 witnesses actually were reliable. And there is sort of there's a sort of archival documentary pieces of primary source material that both suggest that these witnesses were not particularly reliable, but also at the same time there are some that suggest that these witnesses were particularly reliable. So the actual true extent to which Boethius had been wrapped up in the planning of a revolution is obviously up for debate. But obviously you should always take these ideas and these charges with a pinch of salt, because back then it was very, very easy to basically make up any charge against anyone if they lose favour in the courts and the senates and all of the different political institutions, and their downfall can be just the basic power struggles that existed within these societies. Finally, then, let's just spend a tiny bit of time focusing on the contributions to philosophy. We shall be looking at his contributions to philosophy through the next couple of lessons specifically, but the next lesson is going to talk a lot about his consolidations, which is not his contributions to the translations of philosophical texts, but specifically his contributions to philosophy from a novel perspective, his novel contributions to philosophy. That will be the next lesson before we start to move on to looking at the influences of the Islamic world on medieval philosophy from the Western perspective as well.